Welcome back, everyone. So here we are to start our third and final session for today. And so it's entitled Special Issues and Final Recommendations, but it's also a place we're going to spend some particular time talking about whistleblowers. That's been something that's come up both in the first and second panel, but really a bigger focus here as well. Also, I just wanted to mention we'll try to reserve some specific time at the end of the panel to speak directly to some of the questions. A number of them we've tried to integrate into our comments, or I've indicated one or two might be really the topic for our next roundtable, but stay to the end. We'll try to tackle some of those questions. The other thing I just wanted to reiterate, in case some of you weren't on when I mentioned this in the last session, a lot of the cases and examples that we've discussed can be found on the website that goes with Whistling at the Fake. So I encourage you to go back to the website, look at that, and you'll find more information in the news area on these cases, as well as some others that we didn't quite have a chance to get to. One of the topics in last session that we didn't explore quite as much as I'd hoped we'd have time was social media. We had done some of that in the first session, and you can find some great information and examples on the website to kind of continue your contemplation of these questions. All right, so to bring us into our next and final session now, I wanted to turn to a version of the question we've talked a little bit about, which is, although problems with information are not new, they seem different, they seem escalated, maybe of a different quality now than perhaps in the past. I want to take that question or observation and focus it on the pandemic. And sort of really ask a question, sort of, how has the pandemic impacted, changed, exacerbated the kinds of challenges we're seeing with information, disinformation, that aren't entirely new, but really start to look different in the pandemic. So I'll first just open it up for sort of initial observations.
I can just say generically that a number of different organizations globally tracked an enormous increase and uptick in whistleblowing as a result of the pandemic. So the SEC, I think, said a 30 to 40% increase. I know HMRC in the UK, which has the furlough program, also unprecedented numbers. So I'll start us off there.
You can't stop with that, Mary. Now I'm just really curious. What would be that I can't say if you'd asked me to bet which way it went this year, that would possibly have been my answer. Is there any intuition that you or others have about why that might be the case?
There's lots of theories, and there are lots of people in the audience who are whistleblowers themselves and other folks that are probably much more better positioned than I am. But as someone who represented whistleblowers for 25 years, my sense here is that we have when you have a huge disruption like this, people are, I think you have to look at a lot of the folks that have lost jobs, are feeling insecure. So I think that's part of it, is maybe the typical loyalties that whistleblowers will often face, or the fact that they have a paycheck and that it's very difficult to speak up and jeopardize that and what comes with that. They may have felt freer to do that. I think that's one thing. I also think that another commentator had speculated that because we're not meeting in person anymore, imagine being a new joiner in an organization or company at a time of the pandemic. You'll be handed the policy handbook, but you may not get that water cooler talk and other things where we say, you know what, you didn't get the memo, but this is not how we do things around here. So I just think it's a really complicated question. Those are just a few of my observations.
Poppy is about to turn it over to you because you unmuted, but before so, I just wanted to mention for some new members of the audience, we encourage you to participate through the Q&A function. We're not able to use the hand raising or chat function for this, so we're doing Q&A, so I encourage you to go directly there. Poppy.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize everything that I just said, and just from our own observations, I think it's fair to say we've seen a huge increase in people coming to us who were only at their jobs for a short period of time. And that's an unusual factor that's not our normal whistleblower profile. And I think it has to do with what Mary said, that we're just, everyone is separated from their organization. They're not being indoctrinated. So it's actually far faster and easier for people to see that things are wrong. And they don't have the same loyalty. They don't have the same interest in sort of continuing that. And I, and this is just my own pure speculation. There is so much emphasis on disinformation right now because of the pandemic, because people are fighting every which way. I think people are very attuned to it. And so whistleblowers who are very focused on disinformation and very focused on trying to stop it, and that's, coming from some deep well within themselves of wanting to stop that, they're not putting up with it. And they're not giving the benefit of the doubt, and they're trying to do something.
I wanted to pick up on one thread of that, Poppy. You mentioned that this, what for me was a sort of surprising sort of reality, maybe seeing more whistleblowers, but sort of putting it in part against a context in which through the pandemic, we're seeing an increased focus on disinformation. I want to come back to that and just sort of ask a little bit about, what's your sense? And it can just be just sort of, from just kind of observing as best you can, why the pandemic may have exacerbated the issue of mis and disinformation. What are people more vulnerable? What forces might we see at work here, and how we might begin to think about that?
I mean, I think it is the vulnerability. I think it's, misinformation right now is a matter of life and death. People are dying because they're getting misinformation and because they believe misinformation. And that is just, it's really bringing into stark relief the importance of misinformation. And I think, certainly in America, it's also coming on the end of 4 years of President Trump, where there was a huge focus on what the definition of misinformation is and who's spreading it and how it gets accepted, and this just sort of deluge of misinformation from every corner. So I think it's there's a lot of reasons that it's top of mind for people right now.
I would also add that there's unprecedented amount of money that governments have had to put into systems in terms of relief for a pandemic and the economic consequences and health consequences that has not had any guard dogs or watchdogs, with very little oversight. Billions and billions of dollars worldwide have been funneled into programs. And that is probably the best place in information asymmetry, where whistleblowers can expose they're standing in the shoes for the government auditors and regulators who maybe haven't caught up quite yet to saying, you know what, this company that just applied for a PPP loan never existed before March 2020.
Martin?
I mean, from the UK perspective, I mean, and also, I guess, from a personal stay-at-home perspective, watching my own family deal with this crisis, what you see around us is the stress testing that comes from a national crisis. Obviously an international crisis too, but in this context, a national crisis. And I think it's quite interesting. You can do almost a tick list of which institutions have done well and which institutions have done badly. So just off the top of my head, in the UK, our scientific institutions have done pretty damn well. Our health service, despite huge underfunding, has done pretty well. Journalism actually has done an amazing job, despite everything I've previously said in this conversation. Police, not such a good job. And then in terms of our democracy, there's been some serious questions to answer. And what has been flushed out by this pandemic is, in the UK, I mean, there's an article in Index on Censorship here, no corruption, please, we're British. We think we don't do corruption. We think we don't do fraud. And in fact, astonishing levels of fraud have been carried out in the UK under the cover of the pandemic. And corruption that comes very, very close to to government, and this has been immensely shocking. But I think that one of the things that happens in a crisis is that you test the major institutions of state, and in terms of fraud, that's all come tumbling out in the UK. Should I
Martin,
say?
I was going to say, part of what you picked up on, I just want to highlight, we'll be looking at in our second roundtable, really, as we start to look more closely at the public sphere and think about some of those issues of corruption in government. I think that's going to be really important. But obviously, it's always an intersection, because it's typically going to be, say, a business outside of government and intersecting. I was just curious whether any of you had any thoughts on sort of the position of big pharma coming, through the past 2 years, and are there ways in which their unique position of power and importance is something that we need to be thinking about in terms of information and how it's being shared, not shared? Anything there that strike you?
We love big pharma now, don't we? They're just fantastic. Sorry, just to dip back in, but it's if we had my former whistleblower Catherine Gunn here today, she would be making arguments that under the guise of the pandemic, big pharma has taken us all for a ride, and the whole thing is a conspiracy. So I'm sure the people around this table have a particular, she would say, establishment position on this. But I think it is legitimate to raise questions about whether we become complacent as a result of our completely understandable respect for what science and big pharma has done during this pandemic. Doesn't mean that we're vaccine skeptics as a result.
Maureen.
Yeah, I just want to say, I think that while a lot of, I think the focus has gone to the kind of debate around vaccines and the disinformation space that's happened around that space, I think one thing, when you kind of zoom out, that we may have kind of stepped into here now post-COVID, or in this COVID era, is the fact that we are now just going to be living in a space where access to public spaces is going to be very much regulated by our biodata, and we're not really set up for what that means, or what the implications of that are, or how it should be administered, or when and where, and we're kind of like backing our way into it through crisis. And I think that if it's just, from a lot of people I've spoken to, it's ripe with concern, because it is just an area that's it's completely different from country to country, and there will be we will see, call them bad actors, call them Cambridge Analytica-esque type situations in that space of kind of this question of your biodata giving you access to certain benefits in society and not. And I think those abuses, when they come, will just help the case of those who have been against vaccines, to kind of further the whole conspiracy that you see this was all a plan. So how we kind of get prepared for those, and what we can do, are all things that I think we should be looking at, because it is a major issue. And of course, as we've seen in the past, there are a lot of terrifying groups out there that have very dangerous opinions about whose genetics should be superior to others, and who should get access to what in society. And as we see nativist currents spreading in Western democracies, you can just kind of see the writing on the wall of a kind of gray conflagration in that space. So these are all the things we're currently worried about. We've been working on something to kind of continue in the spirit of the Great Hack. I'd love to talk to all of you about that in private, as more of a series format to kind of continue the space and open it up to a lot more people and collaborators, because we really think that there just needs to be an ongoing kind of public interest communication, storytelling, whatever word you want to say, project, because it's the amount of anxiety isn't going away, and the scope of it is way beyond, you know, quote unquote politics or elections, as people were talking about it a couple years back. So I think we're in an area now where, you know, this has become much more of an acute threat to the layman, and with that, I think it's imperative that we figure out adept communication strategies that take some of this stuff outside of the concern of, do you care about the sanctity of the election, to kind of, unfortunately, even more graver and everyday situations.
And Kareem, I just wanted to, before going to Maurizio, you know, listening to you, it really, you know, it seems so much more powerful when you think about sort of the backdrop. And I can't remember, Poppy, if it was you who said it or a couple of, you know, all these questions, important questions, are coming to the fore in a context in which people are both highly anxious and highly socially divided, certainly in the US. And I think, as you're highlighting, when you start to see, you know, more nativist groups kind of re-emerging, you know, certainly not unique to the US, but sort of the social divides I can speak to seeing here in a period in which people are anxious. And then you have these really important issues and questions that society does need to be looking at. It really is a challenge. Maurizio, I wanted to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Diane. I'm just picking up on big pharma issue from the European Union perspective. We have this issue that we've been discussing in our prep meeting, wall of secrecy raised by the European Commission over the three big contracts, umbrella contracts, that frame contracts that were signed by the European Commission on behalf of the member states, with the big pharmas distributing or manufacturing the vaccines, anti-COVID vaccines, AstraZeneca, Pfizer, and Moderna. There was an issue on why the terms and conditions of those contracts were kept secret. And there were many members of European Parliament trying to access the contents of those contracts, and they were denied the access, or if they were admitted to the contents, they were forced to sign NDAs in order not to disclose. And this is, of course, brings up the problem of whether it was really a matter of public interest in keeping those terms and conditions secret, mainly commercial terms and conditions, prices, delivery dates, and amount of vaccines to be delivered within certain dates. One of the justification for that brought up by the big pharmas were those are trade secrets, so we need to protect our trade secrets, and the EU Commission also said, oh, this is an antitrust issue. If we give access to each other to contracts, that might turn out into be a sort of cartel or sharing information among competitors. One other thing I want to add is that currently in Rome, and before the Court of Rome, there is a Codacons claim. Codacons is the biggest consumer association in Italy that is acting against Pfizer Italy in order to have access to the Pfizer contract. And there was a problem of standing. There was a problem of other problems, procedural problems that made the judge deny the access to those contracts. So I think that brings up the problem of using, again, as I was saying in my first intervention, that sometimes you use the use of antitrust rules or IP rights protection is misused in order to protect from access to public information that should be public, should be in the public interest to be accessed. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you on that. And you're right, it does connect back to those other examples of looking at strategic use of, the legal system. We have so much I'd like to cover in our remaining time. I thought right now I would shift gears a little bit to really open us up directly to, the topic of whistleblowers and their role in, helping society more broadly address information disinformation. And so, Ryan, why don't we just start with you? I saw you unmuted, and if you want to get us go.
Well, it's nice to join all of you. I just wanted to share I'm an organizational psychologist and just have done research interviewing 50 individuals that are independent thinkers and can help overcome the bonds of conformity that we mentioned. And that's one of the things that's come up in that research germane to this conversation is that sometimes with motivating people, sometimes these are whistleblowers, is that the high value they place on reason and truth. And it's something I've been fascinated with and would love to hear other people's opinions on it. It's, where that comes from, where people develop that value for the truth. Is it true or not? And sometimes that that value and whistleblowers I've spoken to, usually it's they're somewhat of a loner, or they're willing to trade off the desire to be part of the group for that value that they place on truth, being sort of one of the highest values, as one of the individuals I spoke to said. So I'm kind of interested in where that comes from. Sometimes it comes from a scientific mindset in life, and and obviously that would be it's been heightened more, as we sort of mentioned earlier, that through the last 5 years in the Trump presidency, and then now vaccine, where it's a matter of life and death. But this value placed on reason and truth, where it comes from, how we can how we cultivate it more in individuals, and so it's one thing I've been fascinated with, trying to uncover that value and the source of it, and then how we can help people develop that value.
Great. And your description there of sort of who might be this kind of person who'd be an independent thinker, willing enough to maybe take on the risk, Dan, that you wanted to alert your own students to, of being a whistleblower, the degree to which the pandemic period and maybe a different kind of workplace environment, connection to business, to your coworkers, how that also could, the changes there fit a little bit with what you're describing as who and how someone might be more inclined to be an independent thinker. It's probably a spectrum and not just, two buckets, and sort of what moves you towards one end or the other. I guess I thought, and this kind of fits nicely again too, Ryan, with thinking about how we might, if we understand the challenges, how do you help people sort of, if you understand the challenges that a whistleblower faces, help them make that step to sort of the kind of, sharing of accurate information that they feel is so important. And so I think I'll turn it to the rest of the group and sort of ask what, across your varying experiences, and you really mostly all have had some with the whistleblower context, what are some of the major barriers and challenges? And you might think particularly in the context of, kind of as we're thinking about information disinformation, that whistleblowers face. What makes it hard?
I can talk a little bit about a story of a client of ours. So we represent Tyler Schultz, who's one of the Theranos whistleblowers. And right, I think we all appreciate and know his story in terms of the book Bad Blood, and that he was really the source of John Carreyrou's first story in the Wall Street Journal that was the first time putting any sort of a black eye on the face of a company that was considered a darling. And that article showed that Tyler had been served in his grandfather's house. His grandfather's on the board of Theranos, former Secretary of State George Shultz. He was served with a subpoena from Theranos's lawyers, Roy Schiller, that basically said he violated a confidentiality agreement. And that he had spent, and his parents, I think, had to take out a mortgage on their home, over $400,000 in attorney's fees in defending against this. So, you know, we've talked in earlier sessions about slap suits and the all the means that large companies have to engage in character assassination. I mean, you look at the Weinstein phenomenon and taking, you know, I think it was BlackRock or some former Black Cube, I think, sorry, some former Israeli intelligence services people trying to get in and embed actress Rose McGowan's network. Like, they have all of these resources and the ability to put it at their disposal, which I think is really interesting when you actually look at Frances Haugen and see that 4 whistleblowers of that magnitude taking on massive organizations, the amount of resources you need to put behind them. So, you know, the companies can sue you for theft of documents, breach of your confidentiality agreements, trade secrets, theft of trade secrets. You know, those are the legal mechanisms, and then there's the character assassination and other things. So those are just a few things.
Already daunted, Mary. Poppy.
Yeah, I mean, it's all of those things that Mary just mentioned are problems for the whistleblowers that we deal with. And even more than that, there, you know, taking a step back, there's the psychological factor where, you know, you're the only person who's calling out the truth and everyone else is telling you that it's not a problem. And that can make you feel a little crazy. And, you know, to go back to our earlier conversation about conspiracy theories, like, a large number of our clients come to us saying, I know this sounds like a conspiracy, but, and, you know, that sort of self-doubt that comes from there, that's very hard to overcome. And companies are very, very good at telling people that, you know, oh, no, it's not really a problem. Yes, I realize that looks corrupt, but those payments are fine, you know, what have you. And that's a huge mental barrier to overcome, to even be willing to speak out.
Yeah, I just want to say, you know, it's interesting, like I found myself now in 3 projects, starting with The Great Hack and then with our series called The Vow, which was about a group of people who were part of this company, Nexium, that then kind of blew the whistle and ended up taking it down and exposed it for being kind of a cult and a sex cult and all kinds of other things, and led to federal investigation. And the leader being in jail for 100 years now. And now with the Boeing project, another kind of situation where we filmed Ed Pearson, who I was introduced to by people close to this call, without naming them, and we went on this, you know, crazy journey with him, as he, you know, is a guy who was very much from Boeing country. His wife's whole family worked at Boeing, and he kind of took this position where he came forward and exposed a lot of things about the MAX and about the factory conditions and his observations as to why the crashes happened. And I think each of these cases is completely different types of situations. But what I've learned is that it is, as many have said on this call, it is extremely terrifying for these people. It is extremely lonely. It is not a, you know, you don't get the hero's welcome you're expecting. It's long, and people need support, you know, and they need guidance. And we, as a community of people, who are trying to kind of get these messages out there, need to know each other more and speak to each other and see how we can collaborate. So that's why I think panels like these are helpful, so we can kind of get out of our disciplines as well and see how kind of from academia to, you know, film and writing to legal sides of things, we can all kind of research, and we all kind of collaborate on how we elevate these stories and get them out there. Because I think in the era of benevolent billionaires, whistleblowers, unfortunately, are increasingly more and more a weapon we rely on, for better or for worse. I don't know how sustainable it is, and I think it's an unfair amount of burden to put on them.
Martin, did you want to? Oh, I misread.
No, it's fine. I would like to say something just briefly, which is I've seen from some of the comments and some of the questions from the audience as well, which contains a number of whistleblowers, that it would be good to think of some practical ways in which we can enhance protections for whistleblowers. I mean, at the moment, you do as a whistleblower kind of throw yourselves into the ether, or into sort of open arena. Whistleblowers often don't necessarily know exactly what's going to happen. They might post a letter or email someone, thinking that this is somehow, the very act of whistleblowing is somehow going to bring the corruption down, and it's clearly a lot more complicated than that, a lot more difficult than that. But when they do decide to go public, if they do go public, it's often extremely painful, as I've said before, but we who benefit from them, whether it's lawyers or journalists, and we do benefit from their actions, and society benefits from their actions, I think we need to think of more practical ways of wrapping care around them. And because what can very quickly happen, as some people have already said, is you go from being the most rational person in the room to someone who's been put under so much pressure that you are no longer rational. So you go from rational to whistleblowing to obsessive to then actually genuinely having mental health problems. And this has happened on a number of occasions with whistleblowers who have come to me, and I feel absolutely terrible that this has happened to them. I've benefited from my journalism. They have done huge public benefit, and yet they end up being chewed up and spat out, and often with serious mental health problems. And as a society, we need to take account of this, and I'd be interested to hear what people think about how we can do better by them.
Ryan, I actually, related to that, I thought I might turn it to you and ask a question, which is, to the extent you are looking at independent thinkers, which is, obviously a strong characteristic of whistleblowers. Not everyone's an independent thinker actually blows a whistle, but that seems to be a characteristic. What do you see as sort of the ways in which they're supported? What makes them feel comfortable being independent, and how could we take those insights into thinking about the kinds of either formal reforms that we would imagine, or the softer supports that those of us, as Martin says, who benefit from their participation in kind of the process of whistleblowing, how we might imagine, helping?
Well, there's the very simple, first obvious, of having some validation of at least one ally or one person. Just even in the social psychology studies, where you've got, people judging the length of lines, for example, and you're the only one, you do start to think you're crazy and something's wrong with me. If you have just one other person, that makes just a huge difference. And that isn't the case with Enron and Sharon Watkins studying her. You have just a little bit of social support is just the very first step of helping people. So, and I really liked how it was framed earlier, wrapping by Martin, wrapping people in this sense of care, and how difficult it would be to go through this. That experience. I've not personally been a whistleblower, but I really admire, and I think everybody knows what they're doing, and And so, but that would be the first thing is to get, you know, another person, another ally within that's seeing it the same way, so you don't feel crazy. So,
Mary?
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think there's some really interesting developments going on tech-wise. I think it's solidarity is the key. I was on a panel last night with Tom Devine from the Government Accountability Project, and we were giving advice to tech workers on what to do, and he basically said it's all about solidarity, solidarity, solidarity. So I think it's interesting that Ryan's research that he pointed to suggests that. But we've seen it practically as well, that there's an interesting new startup in the space of supplying internal reporting mechanisms for companies. With the EU directive that Maurizio mentioned, now the 27 member states, soon any company, private or public, with 50 or more employees is going to have a mechanism for reporting internally. And what's so fascinating is there's the startup that's got Google funding, and it's called Vault. And they have something called the Go Together feature. And it's something that's fascinating to me because they're going off research that women and people of color are less likely to report alone, but if you put them with someone else, they will. And so they have a feature where kind of coming out of the Me Too movement, where you can report in a pending status, typically like a sexual harassment claim, and it can be against a particular perpetrator, and you can say, I don't want it to get sent up to the company yet, unless and until I get paired with someone else who says the same thing. And so in doing that, you're kind of overcoming the impediments. And they now have funding to do that matching more sophisticated basis, not just on perpetrators, but actually on types of fraud. So you can imagine with the VW scandal, a type of scandal where we saw, you know, whistleblowers, the diesel cheating device, the emission cheating device was used by the entire industry. And how powerful a tool like that could have been if there was some way of matching these whistleblowers up and putting them together. So I think solidarity is really, really important. And I think when you look at Theranos, companies know that. That's why they silo you and keep you separate, right? They don't want you to have that collective action, that collective experience. But it does very much come from this gaslighting phenomenon that Poppy referred to of you imagine being a whistleblower and you actually bring the information forward and you don't even think you're a whistleblower. You're like, my job is head of internal audit. I'm supposed to be telling you about this problem, right? That we're not meeting our numbers and it seems like there's some fictitious accounts in here. What are we going to do? All of a sudden you expose that, you touch the third rail, and instead of being applauded for doing your job, you know, all of a sudden people close rank around you and you become radioactive. And that's the issue. And part of the radioactivity is to send a signal to those other whistleblowers. Don't you dare touch the third rail. Look what happens to, you know, Joanne over here in Cubicle A. So yeah, I just think it's a really interesting phenomenon, and Martin is absolutely right. And we're starting to see it in terms of wrapping your arms around people. Is Frances Haugen has a team of lawyers, PR people, funders, you know, just psychological support, like a crowdfunding, like that. We're starting to see that model, and hopefully that model will be replicated, but it has to be replicated not just for the whistleblowers taking on the massive organizations, but in different settings as well.
I was going to ask, following up on that, Mary, because what you described really would be a step outside of regulation and law. That is, it's other parties really sort of providing support to the whistleblower as they continue on that journey. I guess I would open up for a question of, to the extent we're trying to think about either how you might imagine that could help, that could emerge sua sponte, but are there other things either through the legal system or more formally that we would want to be focusing on to further support whistleblowers? And I think there's obviously a lot of critique of existing regimes and levels of protection and varying by country. But I thought maybe if any of you wanted to sort of highlight a few key points sort of on that aspect of it, that might be really helpful.
You know, it has to be this sort of multifaceted approach that we're talking about. It definitely comes from regulators to some degree. So, the SEC, for example, with the notable exception during the Trump administration, has taken an extraordinarily aggressive approach enforcing its anti-retaliation provisions for whistleblowers who report to the SEC. And I have no doubt that the success of the program and the growth of the program has a lot to do with that. Whistleblowers see that and know that they're supported and know that the agency has their back. So that's got to be part of it. And then I think the other part of it is the solidarity that Mary's talking about. And Frances Hogan is a great example, but then there's other organizations out there like, the Signals Network, who is doing a lot to try to give whistleblowers the information they need and make sure that they're in touch with each other. There's, the Tech Workers Handbook that just came out of walking whistleblowers in the tech industry, but really everywhere through the process, preparing them mentally, making sure that they have the support that they need. And these are new things and that are coming about very quickly. And I think it's only going to grow as people realize that this is as much a part of the process as anything else. Earlier we talked about how, the press has always been part of a lawsuit strategy, particularly on a company side. And now I feel like the whistleblowers are understanding that it's also true for us. For whistleblowers, obviously, it's more complicated because oftentimes cases are confidential, or, in the False Claims Act realm in the US, it's under seal. We can't talk about cases, which makes the sort of publicity angle a little bit more difficult. But it does seem like when those legal strictures aren't there, people are finding creative ways to, push their case forward.
Mary?
I agree with Poppy, and just would say that in the United States, we're in love with the idea of whistleblower rewards and reward programs. I think it's too facile to say it's just rewards. Those reward programs, as Poppy was just alluding to with the SEC, come with also protections as well against retaliation. But the success of those programs has been what has spawned more and more programs. So I think when we talk about what supports do whistleblowers need in the United States, we've answered that, or at least a number of agencies have answered that by saying whistleblowers are so effective at giving us the roadmap to the fraud that we know they can't live on the air they breathe alone, and that they undertake significant risk by coming forward. So we put underneath them this idea of sharing a percentage of any fine we impose as a way of recognizing and encouraging them, if they're sitting on the fence, they want to do the right thing, but they have a family to feed, that maybe this will tip them over the edge. So, we've seen this expand in my career. It started in a very narrow area. Now we have the IRS, the SEC, the CFTC. Now, as we were talking about earlier, the FinCEN has one for money laundering. And now, interestingly, the first time we moved into the safety sphere is the Department of Transportation has a program as well. So that's one of the ways we see, but at the same time, it's really fascinating to watch what the EU is doing. As Maurizio alluded to with the EU directive, one of the things they've done in a very concrete way is they've shifted the burden of proof in retaliation cases and put the burden of proof on the employer. That's a phenomenal fundamental shift, right? Because in the United States, we have a lot of separate retaliation laws. We don't have a global one like there is in the UK. We have a ways to go. And our success rate is like only 10% of whistleblowers win when they take it all the way to trial, and only 20 to 30% settle. So I'm very interested to watch and see what happens in terms of by shifting that burden. That's just, so I think we're all trying to learn from each other, and there's creative approaches that are happening. But that's just a little bit more of context.
That Mary really helps highlight. I think, people are sometimes very familiar with the money aspect, the monetary support, shall we say, for whistleblowers, but really highlighting some of the other legal frames that can be really quite critical. at this point want to turn, we have had some great questions come through the chat. And so I just wanted to have us walk through a few of them in our remaining time. And, some are targeted more towards either different issues or different panelists. But here, start with the first question. Will shareholders, and Joseph, this might be particularly relevant for you. Will shareholders, often mutual funds, be part of the solution to ensure that corporate leaders, both at board and executive spheres, respond more successfully as they deal with these issues? I don't know if you'd like to offer some thoughts.
The empirical studies, I suppose, are mixed on this, unfortunately. But yeah, it's a good question, and I really think so. Just in terms of the type of not proxy actions, we're not going to do that. But you can see, in terms of the voice exit voice mechanism, I think we see that being much more substantial in index funds. There's a lot of empirical studies on attacking greenwashing, for example. Lots of mutual funds are out in front on that. Pharma washing, all these companies where the mutual funds have been essentially rotating. A lot of the rotation comes from seeking out this type of fraud or scam. So I think yes, on the one hand. In the longer term, slightly pessimistic in terms of the sustainability of this business model, but I do think that the rise of the so-called passive investor in this area is beginning to produce some interim results.
Great, thank you. The next question, I'll just kind of read it and give you a sense. It says, in the UK, a whistleblower is only protected by law if they disclose about one of 6 things: crime, breach of legal obligation, miscarriage of justice, health and safety breach, or a cover-up of any of the others I mentioned. And so the question is the panel advocating a new criterion of, say, mis or disinformation? Or is that a shorthand for one of these sort of qualifying harms sort of already in the law, at least in the UK context? And I hear that question, to me, it kind of almost brings me back to the first panel when we start talking about if you are putting out there, false information, inaccurate information, true information, but in a context that's sort of manipulative. Okay, you've done that. But is that automatically fraud? Like, what are we trying to imagine here? So just curious if anyone wanted to begin to tackle that question.
I'll just very quickly say we definitely have a problem with, well, we know this, but governments using PR firms and black ops. And I think that gets ignored, and we too often fail to talk about the role of politicians in spreading this. And of course, there's one famous one in this country, but it's global. And so I think, we had the case of Bell Pottinger in South Africa, but I think there just hasn't been enough of a spotlight shone on that. And I can imagine a number of people in situations that should be blowing the whistle on the use of that, partly because I think as a society, we haven't really talked about what's, there's this term that the platforms use, coordinated inauthentic behavior, which is this catch-all phrase. But you might remember when the TikTok teens all bought tickets for the Trump rally and didn't turn up. Like, is that coordinated inauthentic behavior? I mean, so we can't really work out when we want to use these techniques and when we don't, and it depends who it is and whether we like them or not. But I think in this context, thinking about a new category for whistleblowers is really interesting, but I think it's challenging because, as this discussion shows us, we're still going around the houses around definitions. But I do think there is a use of these platforms that many of us would be like, there's something dodgy about that and we should talk about it. And I think we should talk more about the use of automation and coordination by politicians that at the moment we're not talking about enough.
Claire, you're doing a great promo for the next roundtable. So yeah, absolutely. And, I think the question definitely hits on that subject, but also, as you pointed out, just simply, raises the fact that it's challenging for us to collectively decide what kind of boundaries we're talking about and when is certain behavior something that we deem problematic and when is it not. I don't know that we have a bright line answer to sort of whether or not we're imagining the whistleblower law literally expanding or not. I think that's really an interesting question and probably requires to break down a lot more examples. Because on the one hand, I'm thinking, well, maybe you can just put a lot under miscarriage of justice. I'm not sure. Did anyone else want to offer a comment there? If not, I'll go on to our next one. So the next question, there's a wide recognition that whistleblowers are key to the revelation of fraud, corruption, abuse, and other forms of immorality. So why is there an insufficiency in the protective measures to sanction those who take reprisals against them? And in a sense, insufficient compensatory measures to really support them, given they're going to likely suffer financially. And most importantly, why is it that politicians in particular seem so reluctant to address these failures in policy? So really, it's sort of taking, to the extent we've been identifying gaps in the regimes for whistleblowers, why? Like we were talking about how we would fix it. What are good examples? What are good improvements? Why aren't they happening? Poppy?
Unfortunately, I think there still is a lot of public distrust of whistleblowers. It was so interesting in the recent Theranos trial that there was comments that came out from the jury about one of the whistleblowers, Erica Chung, how they just, quote, didn't trust her. And they were questionable about her motive. I mean, what was her possible motive except for the truth in that situation? She wasn't, she didn't earn money from blowing the whistle. She didn't have any personal vendetta. She was just trying to get the truth out there. And yet there still was this real distrust of her. Whistleblowers are still sort of, they're called snitches, right? They're this idea that you're going against the community, that you're coming out, and that public perception is very hard to fight, and I think is really unfortunate that we still have it. And there's a lot of whistleblowers who don't want to call themselves whistleblowers because they think of it as a dirty word, we see this still, and I have some hope that that's changing, and that there really in the last couple of years, there's a real recognition that being a whistleblower is a good thing, and that it means that you're, standing for truth, and you're trying to, and oftentimes you're just trying to improve the organization you're part of and trying to get them to do what they said they were going to do in the first place. And so hopefully the laws will then follow, but for now, we're still sort of stuck in this loop where there's just a lot of public distrust.
Martin?
I think Danny wants to go first.
I was just going to make a brief response as well. I'd just like to, we in America, much more so than in the EU, we're wedded to this employment at will doctrine. You can't seem to get rid of it. Where both the rich and the poor have the same right to, or follow the same laws, not to to not be able to steal bread, or whatever the saying is. But that and it's, I think it goes back to the myth of market fundamentalism. It's also true that whistleblowers are not always right, and whistleblowers can erode camaraderie and disrupt the efficiency of the organization. And you can use an overly generous whistleblowing law to protect you when you're really just a malcontent and you're not very productive. Now, I think in the imagination of the public policymakers and the public at large, they think that that's a lot more common than it really is, but it does happen. In fact, we had brought in a guest speaker from the IRS when I used to teach at the University of Maryland, and he was accused of being of firing somebody because the guy was blowing the whistle. He wound up going to a federal circuit court and spending a bunch of money and having all sorts of stress, and eventually wins this case because the guy wasn't a legitimate whistleblower. So if you do, there is a reason why there's they play devil's advocate, that widespread invitation of allowing anyone who claims the mantle of whistleblowing to avoid repercussions can have some unintended consequences to efficiency. Not that although I'm in favor of greater protections of whistleblowers, I'm just saying there is another side of the argument, and I do think a lot of it is myth, but there is some truth as well.
Martin, did you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are people who torpedo organizations, you know, and organizations need to put in protections to make sure that doesn't happen. But I suppose my concern is more for the people who've kind of gone through the process, clearly are whistleblowers and are out the other side. And my worry is that the incentives just don't really work in the other direction towards them. So, and I see it all the time in journalism, whistleblowers are only as useful. They are only useful until the story's out there, right? At which point they're not useful anymore. And this is the problem, I think, societally as well, that whistleblowers have a shelf life. And one of the things that tends to drive whistleblowers crazy is that when the attention goes away, it's very difficult to know what to do. So often, in my experience, at the very height of a crisis, you're rather amazed by the resilience of your whistleblower. You know, they're involved in a big court case, or they're at the eye of a storm, and the attention is on them, and you're thinking, God, I'm amazed that you're able to withstand this barrage. But actually, the point at which they become most vulnerable is when the attention goes away, when they've either had a victory, or obviously much more damaging if they've not had a victory. And I think that's the difficulty, because where are the how do you align the incentives as a society to care for people after they've disclosed? I think, and I don't have an answer to that, but it's really important.
Kareem, I was just going to maybe turn to you and ask, you know, is there a way, I mean, you may have other comments as well, but is there a way in which film can help create resilience and have a sort of a longer lasting effect and sort of marking that space? I was just curious what you thought.
You mean in terms of as it relates to like our perceptions of whistleblowers, or
really any, you know, whether it's the broader shift in how we think about whistleblowers, whether by putting it out there in kind of a more, not that the news isn't permanent, but a different kind of permanency. It kind of gives it a longer term credibility and sort of, it meant something. I did it and it meant something. It's there, or anything, or any other thoughts you had on it, really.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I don't think that films can change the world, you know. But I do think that people who watch them can, and I think that you know, one of the things that films can do is they curate and sometimes designate who our heroes are, right? And in a world that's governed pretty much now by Marvel being the main supplier of what heroism looks like today, and the decider of that to so much of the world population, you know, do we see a Marvel film ever being made where a whistleblower is the main character? I don't see that happening, right? So how do we then crack the kind of power structures that be to elevate these types of stories to the highest level? I think that's something that we definitely should be trying to figure out, because it's not going to happen on its own, right? So I think we have to show that these are stories that not only are important, but that they can be accessible to people and that they have a commercial success to them. And until we do that, we need to find our benevolent billionaire to underwrite it, because that's the way the world works these days. So that's what I think.
Thank you so much. It is 1:30. We had some other wonderful questions. I think some of them will be able to fold into the next roundtable. And so I just wanted to remind everyone, the next one will be Friday, February 25th. And that really looks at these issues from the public sector sphere. And we've touched upon that a little bit. I pushed back to hold us up because we had so much really to cover here. But I encourage you all to join us on February 25th. And I would really love to thank our panelists for all of their sort of work, insights, participation. It was a 3-hour and, you know, sort of long session, but it was really beneficial to be able to walk through sort of these categories of topics and really kind of develop it much more intensively here. So I appreciate all of your work, and I look forward to seeing everyone on the 25th. Thank you so much.